I call the member Ian Lees-Galloway.
Mr Speaker, Labor is deeply and sincerely opposed to this legislation. Sir, it shows the arrogance of this national government that the first thing they do after being elected to office for this third term, the first thing they do is to undermine workers' rights, to undermine health and safety at work, and to pass legislation that has just one purpose, and that is to keep wages down. John Key said he was going to govern in the interests of all New Zealanders. But with his first piece of legislation, the first thing that this government does is to drive down wages for the vast majority of ordinary working people. New Zealanders do not want these changes, sir. The overwhelming majority, thousands of submitters, came to the Select Committee, wrote to the Select Committee and told this government, do not pass this law. Sir, I distinctly remember when the Select Committee went down to Christchurch. It was a difficult day. You could tell the strain and the pressure that the people of Christchurch are under. One submitter said something that really hit home with me. She said, we have enough insecurity, enough instability, enough things in our lives that make life so difficult. Please don't add one more thing that will make our lives more insecure. That really hit home with members on our side of the House anyway, sir. But it obviously didn't have an ounce of impact on the government members. Sir, this legislation works to undermine collective bargaining. It works to undermine unions' efforts for industry standards. It brings in niggardly little taxes like the strike tax to punish people who take partial industrial action. And just today, sir, workers at Stats New Zealand are enforcing work-to-rule regulations, and there's no doubt that this government will attack those public servants with the provisions that it is passing in this law today. It removes the Part 6A protections for vulnerable workers, people like the cleaners who come into this building when our work is done, come in and work through the night. Some of the lowest paid and most vulnerable workers in New Zealand are having their rights undermined by this government. It says that employers can just walk away from collective bargaining. So any claims that are made by unions that might be a little bit difficult, that might actually require the employer to sit at the table and work through difficult issues, whether it be about pay, whether it be about conditions, whether it be about the state of the industry, which is something that both the employer and the workers should be interested in. Anything that's difficult, the employer can get up, walk away from the table and get an opinion from the Employment Relations Authority that bargaining has concluded. And then, of course, we know what the employer will do next. It will look to put everybody onto individual employments, divide and rule, and keep wages down. So one of the most insidious aspects of this legislation is the removal of the requirement to put a new employee on the same terms and conditions as any collective agreement in that workplace during the first 30 days. Right now, sir, right now, if an employer wants to put an employee on better terms and conditions than the collective agreement, they're entitled to do so. So the only change, the only thing that this change can be designed to do is to put new employees on less favourable terms and conditions than any collective employment agreement that exists in that workplace. That is the only reason that a government would pass this legislation. What is that designed to do? To make new employees more vulnerable and to drive down wages in the workplace. And I heard the stand-in minister refer to the fact that productivity should be the driver of wage increases, and we on this side of the House absolutely agree. So since 1989, labour productivity in New Zealand has increased by 58%. Wages, real wages in New Zealand, have increased over that period of time by just 18%. The benefits of improved productivity have overwhelmingly gone to the owners of business and not to the workers in businesses. And this government has the gall to say that increased productivity will lead to improved wages and that we shouldn't legislate to strengthen workers' rights so that they have the right to bargain for better wages. Well, sir, clearly, even under the legislative provisions that we have had in the last decade, workers' pay has simply not kept up with productivity. The benefits of improved productivity have been going to the few, the people who National always stand for, and not to the many. So we need strong legislation, the opposite of what this government is passing today, to ensure that a growing economy and better economic outcomes are shared by everybody, not just held by a tiny, privileged few. And that's what today's changes will do, sir. It will enshrine and entrench the privilege of those who have benefited from economic growth over the last decades, and it will continue to disenfranchise those who have struggled to make ends meet, to put food on the table, to put a roof over their families' heads, and to give their families the opportunities that they want. Sir, unlike this government, who doesn't listen when people come to Select Committee and make submissions, we went out to the people of New Zealand over the last week and we asked them what they think of the changes to rest and meal breaks. Sir, we started a petition a mere week ago. Today, that petition was tabled in Parliament. Sir, 51,628 New Zealanders have signed this petition over the last week because they want this government to know that getting rid of rest and meal breaks will make them less safe and less productive at work. On this side of the House, we believe in listening to what New Zealanders have to say. We don't dismiss what ordinary Kiwis have to say about legislation, and we will listen to the 51,628 people who told this government to stop cutting back on rest and meal breaks and the other changes that are in this legislation that undermine the rights of working people. And I know that members opposite think that rest and meal breaks are something insignificant. They think it's a trivial matter. Well, sir, there's plenty of examples of why it's not trivial. Jetstar pilots had to go to the employment court to make sure that their rights under the current legislation for rest and meal breaks were upheld. Because pilots like Richard Greenslade could start work as early as 5 o'clock in the morning and finish as late as midnight. And because they have duties whilst their planes are on the ground, there was no opportunity for pilots like Richard to take a rest and meal break through the day. And the employment court turned around to Jetstar and said, no, under the current law you are required. And I have to say, as someone who flies fairly regularly, I think it's pretty important that our pilots get rest and meal breaks to make sure they are refreshed and ready to pilot that plane, to make sure that they are not just safe at work, but the rest of their passengers are safe as well. The changes to this law that the National Party is passing today would validate Jetstar's decision not to provide rest and meal breaks to pilots like Richard. That endangers the safety of every single person in New Zealand who travels on an aircraft. And there's countless other examples of how workers' safety and the safety of all New Zealanders will be undermined by the changes made in this legislation, sir. So that's why We will listen to the 51,628 people who signed this petition telling the government to keep their rest and meal breaks, to save their rights and not further erode the rights of working people in New Zealand. Sir, Labour is deeply and sincerely opposed to this legislation because it's not in the interest of ordinary working people. It will not improve wages, it will not improve health and safety, it simply makes more people more vulnerable, which frankly is the legacy of this national government.
I call the member Jonathan